Hello and welcome to Bottomless Coffee. My name is Jerome Evans, and on this show we have conversations with people who are having a positive impact on the world around them. And we have those conversations over coffee or tea or hot water. Honestly, as long as the conversation is fabulous, they can drink whatever they want. No pressure. Today we're talking with Ryan Berg from Avenues for Youth about youth homelessness. Ryan started as a youth worker in 2004 and is currently the program manager for the Connect Host Home program of Avenues for Youth. That's a mouthful. Connect provides LGBTQI plus youth culturally responsive housing within their community of choice. In Connect, youth choose which community member they live with, and those community members provide housing and food, while Avenues provides wraparound services and support. Ryan is also the author of No House to Call My Home, Love, Family, and Other Transgressions, which is the winner of the Minnesota Book Award for General Nonfiction and the NCCD Media for a Just Society Award, and was listed as a top 10 LGBTQ book for 2016 by the American Library Association. I need to get this book. He lives in Minneapolis with his two dogs, River and Jack. Hey, Ryan.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Welcome
to Bottomless Coffee.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, homelessness in America. And even in Minneapolis, where we are, it's a hot topic. I would say particularly in the summers here, we start seeing encampments, and we start maybe experiencing it a little more personally than we otherwise do. What can you tell us about homelessness in America and Minnesota and Minneapolis?
Yeah, so on any given night in the state of Minnesota, we have about 6,000 young people who are experiencing housing instability and homelessness.
Really?
Yeah, and we have about 15. We have housing and youth-specific shelter beds for about 15% of those young folks. So the vast majority of youth are having to fend for themselves in order to get their needs met. I think, what's really important to recognize is that these young folks are incredibly resilient, and they have their own dreams, and they are the custodians of their own journey. And part of the work, as someone who kind of walks alongside them in a season of that journey, is to just kind of help elevate them and help them meet their own personal goals.
So the phrase that was coming to my mind, and this is revealing my age, I suspect. The phrase that was coming to my mind is, I was thinking about this conversation is, you think you know, but you have no idea.
Right.
What would surprise us about how people experiencing homelessness are living their lives?
Yeah, I think with young people in particular, their homelessness is brief and hopefully non-reoccurring. So they may be just entering homelessness, or maybe that they're coming from a situation where they've been couch hopping. So oftentimes the young people that we're working with, not all the time, but most of the time, are not necessarily street homeless. Okay. Right? Maybe they're living in shelter. Maybe they're doubled up. They're experiencing a great deal of housing instability.
Okay.
Another thing that I think is super important to remember is that we oftentimes flat people's narratives into a stereotype. These are young people with dreams and aspirations and goals. Oftentimes, though, they can't focus on them because they're focusing on survival. So when you don't know where you're going to lie your head that night, when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, super hard to be engaged with school. It's super hard to be engaged with work. It's super hard to be engaged socially with the folks around you because of the trauma and adversity that you're facing on a daily basis.
So how does Avenues for Youth help?
Yeah, so Avenues has been around since 1994, started by a young woman who had experienced housing instability and homelessness herself. She recognized that there was a lack of youth-specific services available to folks in the Twin Cities. Why youth-specific services are important. Otherwise, youth would have to go into the adult system and be much more vulnerable to exploitation. I think developmentally, we have to be considerate of where young folks are at and what their particular needs may be. And so she started Avenues. It was called Project Foundation at the time. It was in South Minneapolis. And then we moved to North Minneapolis, and we have 2 brick and mortar shelters. So one in North Minneapolis and one in Brooklyn Park, where youth have access to 24-hour support, 3 meals a day. It's a real home environment. There's an integrated health team, so we center mental health and bring a nurse in as well to provide that additional support. Everything we do is around youth determination. So we don't prescribe goals to young folks. Youth get to determine their own goals, and then we're there to support them. So identifying a goal, and then what are the steps I need to take in order to get there?
So we've got 6,000 young people who are experiencing instability.
Yep.
And we've got Avenues for Youth
Yep.
as one service provider.
Correct.
About how many youth are you able to help in a given year?
Yeah, it's about 300 youth.
Oh no.
Through our particular program. So we have 5 programs total. In addition to those 2 brick and mortar shelters, we have 3 community-based programs. 300 young people annually within our programs. We also have about 12 other service providers that are youth specific within the Twin Cities that are providing different ranges of support on the continuum of care. So everything from shelter to transitional living programs to apartments to permanent supportive housing, which is more of like kind of a wraparound support for youth. We have the vast majority of supports within the Twin Cities, and yet we still don't have nearly enough support to meet the need of young folks.
Now, you mentioned there being a lack of services, particularly LGBTQI plus focused services. Does your funding come primarily from private donors or from the state or from, or where does it come from?
Yeah, so the Avenues as a whole, because we have 2 licensed shelters, we have kind of a variety of financial support that can be federal, county, state, in addition to private donors and foundations. The program I run, which is called ConneQT, which is a community-based program for LGBTQ youth, the funding typically comes from private donors and foundations because we don't take government funding. We are outside of the system, and we don't license our homes, and that's on purpose.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Well, what would happen if you licensed your homes?
More bureaucracy, and we want to be able to meet the needs of youth in the moment and the hosts. So Host Home is really a community-based response where folks in the community open their homes, provide food and shelter. We provide wraparound services and support. And so we're outside of the system because we don't want to be focused on meeting the needs of the bureaucracy. We're really focused on meeting the needs of the youth and the host. So I don't care if there's an egress window in the basement of someone's home.
Oh, sure.
I'm more interested in, does this youth feel safe, affirmed, and supported in the environment that they're in?
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
I have a question from a viewer.
Okay.
We know how important housing is to a person's health, and we're in a pandemic. How did your work change, or how did you accomplish your mission over the course of the pandemic?
Yeah. Like everyone and all service providers, we were deeply impacted by the pandemic. Within the ConneQT Host Home program, which is a community response to youth homelessness, where folks share space together, obviously the challenges were great in providing that support. One thing we realized early on is different people identify and define risk differently, right? And how they mitigate that risk may look different based off of your lived experience. So a young person who's had to rely on survival skills their whole life may not have the same definition of risk as someone who's maybe had a more kind of secure upbringing. So finding some commonality in that experience was challenging and hard, but we worked really hard on creating a space in order to do that, especially pre-vaccine.
Sure.
That was really tough. After the vaccine, it became a little easier. I think a lot of the kind of stressors that people were experiencing diminished a little bit around what that meant. We also participated in something called a Trusted Messenger program, which was run by the state and the Department of Health, recognizing within congregate settings and shelters, we needed to spread accurate information around what the pandemic was, how it was transmitted within the community, and what the vaccine was and how it affected folks. So I think, the state and the Department of Health did a great job of recognizing historically Black, Indigenous people of color, LGBTQ folks had medical mistreatment in their histories, maybe for sure, right? And false information was provided, and so there was a mistrust,
absolutely,
within the communities. And so this particular program, the Trusted Messenger program, was around. We've already have relationships with young folks. How do we communicate clearly the messaging that's accurate and kind of push through the false information to get to the core so folks can make educated decisions for themselves around how they'd like to proceed?
So you were the messenger. Was that part of your wraparound services, or did you also have vaccine events, or are you more like setting up appointments or steering youth to an event that would work with their schedule?
For sure. I think it was concurrent. So having accurate information was kind of the foundation and the bedrock. And then Maya, who's our case manager for ConneQT, would then have intentional conversations with youth around, like what would it mean to get vaccinated? Are you interested in actually going and learning more about that at one of our partnering agencies that provide vaccines? So YouthLink, which is downtown Minneapolis, is a drop-in center for youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness. And they had it was a vaccine site. And so youth could go in there, talk to the nurse there, have a more kind of intentional and deeper conversation around the vaccines, and then determine for themselves if they would actually like to go through with the process or not.
I was really almost like belatedly concerned for youth. So I was like, well, if they don't have a sheltered place, like a place to be safe, how are they going to weather the side effects from the vaccine? What do you do? What do you do? Do you have to like find a safe place in the woods, or maybe you reach out to someone that you know and say, listen, I know I crashed on your couch 2 months ago and it was a real problem, but I need this vaccine and I may or may not have side effects for 48 hours.
Right. That's a really good question. Maya works directly with those young folks and figuring out what their needs are. So she did a great job on case by case, figuring out, do you have a safe space to kind of recover if that's a need? A lot of the youth that we're working with are already in our ConneQT Host Home program. So they have their room and they have a safe space to kind of go through that process. Same with youth in shelter at Avenues, have their own rooms, can kind of nest and recover from the side effects if needed. But yeah, I mean, if a young person is in crisis and doesn't have a place to go, what I kind of recognized was that a lot of those folks couldn't really wrap their brains around getting a vaccine when they didn't know where they were going to stay. It was kind of prioritizing their need for themselves. And first of all, it was shelter, food. And then as the dust settled a bit, they were able to have conversations around, we are in the midst of a kind of a medical emergency globally, and there are ways to get some support. Are you interested in looking into that? So it's really hard for folks to kind of hear and learn and ingest that information if they're in crisis. So working towards some stability prior to getting them into that space.
Now, we've been saying youth a lot. What age group? What's the cutoff? When are you no longer young?
Yeah, so within our shelters, we work with young folks ages 16 to 21.
16 to 21.
They can stay for 18 months or their 21st birthday, whichever comes first. But we've also recognized over the years that that's kind of an arbitrary
it's
date.
like, why 16?
Right. And so developmentally, we know that the brain is not fully developed until we're like 27, 28 years old. When you experience a great deal of trauma, that can kind of exacerbate the arrested development that happens with a lot of young folks. So within ConneQT and a lot of serving agencies across the country, the age has been extended out to 24 in order to continue to help young folks meet those needs. They may not be ready to kind of launch out into life independently. And so we want to make sure that we're providing as much support and service as possible.
This is so fascinating because on the podcast, Bottomless Coffee Podcast, we are talking about becoming more trauma informed. So I have read one whole book on trauma, and it happens to reference brain development. And I think it's so interesting that in the LGBTQI plus community, we typically have a pretty standard development cycle, let's say, up until puberty. And that's when things start to, things have the potential to go wrong for us. Those traumatic memories can form. We have a concern about being literally kicked out of our homes and experiencing the same things that your youth are dealing with. Thank you for extending it to 27, because I think a lot of people, particularly when we're talking about Black and brown people, feel as though we look older than we really are, or think that we're adults even at 13, 14, 16, 22.
Right.
Or I was making some dumb mistakes at 22.
I was making some dumb mistakes at 24, 25, 26. Sure. Yeah. And I think it speaks to the need. And you mentioned kind of like developmentally with queer and trans youth too. I think as you start to individuate, puberty is kind of that time where you start to grapple with identity, start to individuate a bit, kind of exercise pushing boundaries and whatnot. And then if you're not in a safer space where you're able to do that and be affirmed, and it's not inclusive, you get kicked out because of exercising that right to kind of be your full self. It can be incredibly traumatic for folks, and the collateral consequences are huge. We know that, right? With the Trevor Project came out this past year with a study around about 45% of LGBTQI youth have considered suicide in the past year. The vast majority are experiencing depression and anxiety at much higher rates than the general population. Suicidality and suicide thoughts are just kind of taking over for a lot of young folks. So the importance of creating a safer, affirming space where youth get to be who they are and don't have to censor aspects of who they are in order to get their needs met is incredibly crucial, especially within the youth serving world, youth serving agency world.
And you briefly made reference to behavior that could be maladaptive. You said, youth are prioritizing shelter, food, and what have you, kind of above their own personal well-being with regard to this virus, and that is a behavior that they, if it lingers for a long time, that they could adopt and maintain over the course of their entire lives, even when they're in a different situation that could be maladaptive.
For sure. Yeah, I think one thing we work on within the context of ConneQT and the host home experience is creating the opportunity for caring, consistent relationships to grow. And I think, we always say in ConneQT that, survival skills don't look pretty in a stable environment. And it takes some time to right that ship, right? It takes some trust. It takes some vulnerability. It takes a very caring and consistent adult to model healthier behavior for young folks, so they can begin to exercise that vulnerability and trust the environment is going to be safe. These young folks have been failed by adults time and time again throughout their lives. So that trust building happens at their speed. So we are very clear with hosts. We want relationship to take place. We know that that's at the core of healing, but it's going to happen at the youth's timeline and not ours. And so just remain patient within that relationship. Yeah.
I want to dial into ConneQT specifically, but I think we should probably take a quick coffee break first. So let's do that, and then we'll be right back. Welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. We are talking with Ryan Berg from Avenues for Youth about ConneQT. So we alluded to ConneQT a little bit before the break, but now let's really dive in.
Okay.
Give me the spiel. What is ConneQT?
Right. Yeah. So ConneQT is a community-based response to LGBTQ youth homelessness. So back in the 90s, the community recognized that there were overrepresentation of queer and trans youth experiencing homelessness and housing instability. They would go to shelters and experience a great deal of discrimination, violence, and harassment based off of sexual orientation or gender identity. And they'd prefer to sleep on the streets and actually utilize those spaces. So the community came together and said, well, what can we do to fill that gap, to provide that space, to provide that affirming support? And they did a feasibility study and recognized that the host home model could potentially be a good fit for this community. And a host home is what it sounds like. It's folks in the community open their homes, provide food and shelter, and then we provide wraparound services and support. Throughout the years, we've recognized the importance of keeping the program small. So we work with about 10 young people at a time. And that's because we want to center a relationship. We want to ensure that Maya is able to meet the needs of young folks and be present for them and build relationship with them. A lot of case managers have 80, 90 youth on their caseloads, and it becomes institutional. And youth don't feel like they are receiving that necessary support. So we kind of flip that. And we also listen to young folks early on about their experiences. And about 40% of youth experiencing housing instability have come through the foster care system.
Okay.
It's a particularly broken system for a lot of young folks.
Yeah.
There are more youth exiting foster care with a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder than there are veterans of war.
Oh my gosh.
Particularly broken system. So we listened to young folks. What didn't work for you? What did in the foster care system? And there were two major complaints. One, I had no say in where I got to stay. Youth were just dropped off and met that foster parent for the first time. And then secondly, the person was paid to care for me. So we flipped that script. Youth get to read the applications of hosts. Hosts don't read the applications of youth. In each application, there's an open letter where hosts write about who I am, why I want to do this, what my community is like, what my home life is like. Youth get to read that and say, oh, I actually want to meet this person. So they're an active participant in the process. They're not just a cog in a wheel. They have agency in that experience. And then secondly, it's a volunteer program. So you don't feel that hosts are patting their pockets to care for them. That has its own set of complications.
Okay.
We live in the state of Minnesota with some of the worst racial disparities in the country.
Sure.
Because of racist practices like redlining and covenants, racial covenants, generations of folks have been cut out of generational wealth, right? BIPOC folks, Black folks.
Oh, I live in a formerly redlined neighborhood. Yeah.
For sure. So folks have been, newly kind of building up wealth. And so who has the means and access to provide that support is limited, right? And so the vast majority of folks we were able to host are white in Minnesota. The vast majority of youth we're working with are BIPOC. So there's an inherent power imbalance within that structure that we are constantly addressing and working with hosts on whiteness, on anti-racist work, on how do we show up authentically for young folks to minimize the misuse of power within the context of host home.
So what is that? So that this is part of the training, I guess, for the family. So what's the whole training look like?
Yeah, so it's 16 hours. Pre-pandemic, we used to do it as a small cohort of folks, creating a space to have challenging conversations so folks can grapple with hard topics. So the first day is really the context of youth homelessness in the state of Minnesota. So an understanding, trauma and resiliency work, positive youth development work. We bring in a panel of hosts to talk about their experience of what it meant to host. And then the next day is turning the lens inward. Why do I want to do this? Why am I showing up? Why is this important to me? What are the unwritten rules of my home? How does anger show up on me, and what may a youth assume about that nonverbal communication that I'm kind of putting out into the world? So bringing the unconscious to the conscious as much as possible within the first part of that training.
Like therapy.
There's a lot of internal work that goes on with becoming a good host, for sure. It's ongoing internal work. And then the second part is the whiteness training. So like I mentioned, vast majority of folks that are able to host in the state of Minnesota are white. Vast majority of youth we're working with are youth of color. How are we showing up in authentic ways that address power and privilege and push against the conditioning that white folks have had? We do have hosts of color as well, so we don't expect hosts of color to sit in and teach white folks about their power and privilege, so they can participate in that training if they want to. It's mandatory for white hosts. It's optional for hosts of color, and hosts of color can caucus and have their own training as well, in addition around how whiteness has affected them, and also power and privilege and how it shows up within the context of caste and class, in addition to race.
So I'm hearing repeatedly now, a lot of Black and brown youth, a lot of white hosts. What's going on in my people's families where our kids are getting kicked out?
Well, I think it's not I would say about the queerness so much as it is about an intersection.
Anecdotally, I'm assuming, yeah.
Intersection of issues, right? Okay. So I think there is a false narrative that reinforces a stereotype. If we say BIPOC youth are getting kicked out because of queer and trans identities, that's, I think, a really false narrative. I think we have to look at the intersection of generational poverty, of systemic racism, of youth that are touched by systems, the collateral consequences of racism on the family unit, right? So we show a great video called The Infamous T during our trainings, and it shows Jonathan and his family of origin. It's Jonathan and his mother and 5 siblings living in a 1-bedroom. And what we see is great love in that relationship, but not the means to provide housing for that young person. So Jonathan has to move into a host home to get those needs met. And so recognizing family of choice, family of origin, and friends, and how all of that kind of comes together as a means of support. So yeah, I don't want to give the wrong impression that it's about BIPOC being more homophobic or transphobic. That's not the case. It's the additional systems of oppression that are in play that kind of add to like a breaking point, right, within family structures. There are families across the board where family rejection is a part of that story.
Sure, but that's anyone.
It's anyone. And it's a painful reality for a lot of young folks, but it's not the whole story. We need to look at systems of oppression as the root cause of homelessness. It's around economic and racial injustice in this country.
Okay. So to be a Connect host, there's training.
Yep.
If you're whiteness training.
Yep.
Is there other elements that training we haven't talked through?
Just the trans/gender 101. So a lot of LGB folks are not really T competent. So creating an affirming space for non-binary and trans youth so they can bring their whole selves. And then the end of the training is youth come in and they tell us what's up. They tell us what's working, what isn't. They're very transparent about their experience. And it really, I think, informs prospective hosts on how to really show up authentically when opening their home to a young person.
And I think you mentioned there is limited bureaucracy involved in becoming a host family. But what are, how many bedrooms do you have to have or what have you? You have to have a backyard. You
don't have to have any of that. You need to create a safe space for a young person. So ideally a bedroom, right?
Okay.
And
ensuite? Or not ensuite?
We try to create a lot of youth really love. There's a lot of homes that have like basement rooms that are furnished and they have their own entrance, so it kind of feels like an apartment.
Oh, okay.
So that's one thing that people really love. But really, it's we ask hosts that, there's kind of an extensive process. So we do background checks, we do application, we do interviews, we do references to ensure that they're a good fit for the program and that their values align with the program's values, and create a safe space. And that's really it. There are different ways that youth can become attached to Connect. So that stranger match that I've just described, but also if a youth is informally being hosted at a family member's or a friend's home, they can back into the program and get support from us too.
Oh, that's neat. So
recognizing that there are people providing that support, but they may not know how to help that young person to the next phase of their life.
Yeah.
We can help with that. Yeah.
So over your time with Avenues and with the Connect program, how have you seen the Connect program kind of transform young people's lives? What are some success stories?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Like I mentioned, like that we know relationship is at the core of healing. It's not an expectation of the program. We don't want youth to feel like, oh, I need to build relationship in order to get housed. But we create that space for it. And when we do create that space for it, bearing witness to that transformational change is one of the most beautiful things about the work that I do. We have had young people build community, build family, after they move out, coming back for Sunday dinners, going on vacations together, really being a part of the family. There was actually someone years ago who was a part of Connect and then went away to college, went to grad school, came back, started working with Connect as our case manager, as a way to kind of give back as well. And they're still a part of the family that they were matched with years ago. So yeah, I mean, the very first young person back in the 90s that was matched ended up being adopted by their family.
Oh, that's an option too.
They did that on their own after they kind of left the program. So it can look many different ways. It can look like friends, mentors, or family.
You've distinguished between the foster system and the ConneQT system. And again, one of the things that was going through my mind is my own household, my own family. I was like, oh, I have a spare bedroom. But I also have a husband who gets very attached. And so we got a dog, and he's like hugging the dog and he says goodbye to the dog, when he's leaving for work. And I'm like, I'm also here,
Right. Bye, honey.
So is what you're describing typical that the youth stays involved, or is that more of like the Rosie example? Is it more typical that the youth comes and they're like, thank you for the space. Now I'm going to go live my own life.
It can look many different ways. And so again, we're not prescribing anything. We're not saying that this is what the expectation would be. It's we're following the lead of the young person. So we've had host home experiences where it's like a roommate, ships passing in the night. We ask hosts to provide food and shelter. Youth may be really active with work, maybe working 2 jobs, not home very often. And the opportunity to build relationship just isn't there. And there's no judgment about that whatsoever. It's actually all about meeting the need, food and shelter. That's the goal. Everything above and beyond the relationship piece is just icing on the cake. It can look many different ways. The examples I gave were not uncommon, but again, not the expectation.
So when we're talking about, there's food and shelter, and then there's the wraparound services. So you've mentioned mental health supports. Are they like, are they going to be more healthy than me? You know what I mean? You're like, is Maya like, hey, you've got to go get your physical. It's been a year. Hey, you've got to go to the eye doctor. Booster shots. You got to get your booster shots.
For sure. Those are conversations that happen.
Yeah.
But it's all youth determined. So we make suggestions to young folks and say, have you considered this? Would this be of interest to you? In my experience, this has been useful for me. Would you like to do something similar? So again, it's being kind of framed around positive youth development. And so it's not a power over relationship with young people, but a power with experience.
It sounds very empowering.
That's the goal.
Young person.
Yep. The goal is that youth have agency in every step of the way in their experience within ConneQT.
Hey, I think the big question, probably the one that people at home have been like, when is Jerome going to ask this question? How can we help all of these young people, 6,000 young people who are experiencing housing instability in Minnesota? What can we do?
Yeah, I think I speak a lot to folks across the state around ways to support. And I think a good way to frame it is the 3 Ps. So what can I do personally? What can I do professionally? And what can I do politically? So personally, sharing with your community. If you believe in the mission of, say, the program ConneQT and our kind of mutual aid model, share within your community. There may be someone who wants to open their home and provide support. So I think just spreading the word, spreading education, and doing so spreads empathy. And that's where I think social change really takes place. Professionally, if you have a employee resource group that does a lunch and learn, invite us to come in and talk about that and explore the topic as much as possible. The book I wrote, No House to Call My Home, what the impetus behind that was really, how do I share the experience to educate folks about this actual issue in order to evoke change? So I use that oftentimes. I do participate in book clubs, that kind of thing. So that's another option. And then politically, make sure our legislators know about this issue and are funneling money into this great need. So like I said, we have housing for about 15% of the youth experiencing housing instability and homelessness. That's state and federally funded and county funded. We need more money. We need to create more LGBT-specific, culturally responsive programming so youth don't feel like they have to censor aspects of who they are in order to get their needs met.
Fabulous. Thank you, for letting us know how we can help. I am very curious about this book, and I want to learn a little bit more about it, but right after a coffee break. Welcome back to Bottomless Coffee with Jerome. We are here with Ryan Berg from Avenues for Youth, and I finally get to ask you about your book, No House to Call My Home, Love, Family, and Other Transgressions. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so the book really chronicles my experience and time working with queer and trans youth within foster care in New York City. So I worked in 2 group homes, congregate settings, one in Brooklyn and one in Queens. And it's really about that experience and how systems fail these young folks time and time again. So at the time, it was one of just a few LGBTQI specific settings for youth. So youth were prior having to go into kind of general population group homes and experiencing a great deal of harassment and violence based off of who they were. So these group homes were created to create more of an affirming space for them. But at the same time, there were just so many systemic challenges in place. And that, I recognized that this was just kind of like this invisible crisis that was taking place that no one was really speaking about. So the impetus behind the book was, let's share these stories in order to evoke change in young people's lives.
And did you expect to win awards and what have you?
That was a great added bonus to helping elevate the story and getting more work out there. A great deal was being able to go on a book tour and speaking to folks across the country. So each city I went to, I made sure that advocates and youth and service providers were all present to talk about the unique challenges and needs within that particular community and how the community can start rallying around these young folks and providing some support.
Now that was it 2016? Was
Correct.
that when it was published?
Yes.
Okay,
Yep.
and then you went on the book tour.
Yep.
The pandemic kind of upended everyone's lives,
Yes.
so I assume you weren't touring during those periods of time, but are you back sharing with people?
Slowly, locally for sure. I just spoke with folks at Hennepin County, doing a book event with them. My last visit was out in Washington State right before the pandemic had started. So hopefully I'll start building up again. My focus has really been on the Connect program, building that program back up again to where it needs to be. Obviously we weren't at capacity during the 2 years of the pandemic. So building that back up again has been my priority, but I hope to get back out and speaking and using the book as a tool to kind of elevate the voices.
I was about to ask you if there were lessons learned from your time in New York that you wrote about, that you then brought to Connect.
That's a great question. I think what I learned was I can't work within the system. That it's too challenging for me to watch these young people butt up against the system. And that's why Connect made so much sense to me, being outside of the system, meeting the needs of the youth and the hosts, and not really focusing on bureaucracy and arcane rules and regulations. Yeah. It's really about community mutual aid, and that's what speaks to me.
It just occurred to me, we've been really having this conversation, and I've been thinking a lot about prospective host families, but I didn't think about the youth who might be watching. What should a young person do if they're like, oh, this program actually sounds great for helping me get out of my situation? How do they reach you? What do they do?
Yeah, so youth can be referred in by no wrong door. So a youth can self-refer, go to avenuesforyouth.org and go to the host home link, and all of our contact information is there. But youth come to us through homeless liaisons, through social workers, through teachers, through faith-based organizations, through family friends. There's really no wrong way to get associated with us. The first step would be to have a conversation with Maya. Maya, talk to the young person about what the program is, how it works, and then see if it's a good fit. Does it feel like the right kind of step for that young person? Even if it's not, Maya will continue to work with them to find the right solution and the right resource. But yeah, that initial first step is just building a relationship with Maya.
And then one of my favorite questions I try to ask everyone who comes on, what is one message, maybe two if you've got two, that you want to make sure that the people at home take away from our conversation?
Yeah. We're we're talking right at the end of Pride Month.
Yeah.
And I think one thing that I think about often is, especially during Pride, is yes, let's celebrate all the successes that the LGBTQI community has made over the years, but let's not forget those who are most marginalized and targeted within our own community. How do we show up? How do we step up? How do we support those who are most marginalized? And currently, the most targeted are our young people. There have been over 300 anti-trans legislated attempts right across the country in the past year. So I would suggest folks find ways to support our young folks, if it's through programs like Connect, if it's through advocating for legislation within our own states and counties and municipalities.
Now, I thought you were going to go with the 3 Ps. I thought you were going to say advocate for youth. Is it personally,
professionally,
and
politically?
And politically.
Yeah. That too.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that all kind of like speaks to one another. Yeah, for sure.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Speaking to political issues, you brought them up. I try not to get too fired up. Why do you think that certain parts of our community, because they're all in our community, our broader Minnesotan community, think that it's fair game to target our young people? Like, why? This is one of the things that keeps me up all night. You know, like, how dare you? Why are you coming for? You don't like to use the word kids, but why are you coming for our kids? I know it's paternalistic of me to use, but I feel protective.
I think it's a political strategy. I think it's
abhorrent, is what it is. But yeah.
Yeah, it's for sure. And it's about fear. So if we can incite irrational fear in the populace, right, then we can gain more political clout and power. So to me, it's not even about trans identity to these folks. They don't see that the consequence is life or death for our youth within the queer community. They just see it as a stepping stone to advance and gain more power and clout through fear mongering within their base.
And it gets me riled up every time. And on the podcast, I had a conversation with someone I'm trying to get on the show. His name is Dr. Spencer Scott. We were talking about climate optimism, of all things. But the practice of optimism and hope is what gets you into the mindset of success.
Yeah.
It's like if I stay mad at what these people are doing, all I'm going to do, I'm going to go on the internet, I'm going to, fight with someone or some comments or what have you. I'm not going to sit down and strategize on how I can leverage my 3 Ps to do better.
Right.
And so I try not to stay in that headspace if I can avoid it.
For sure. And I think one way to do that is listen to youth, listen to the young people. Yeah. They're so resilient. They're so brilliant in ways that they show up for one another. So I think allowing youth to speak their truth and supporting that is a good approach.
Oh, do the Connect youth get to connect with each other?
Yeah, there are opportunities for that to happen as well. We do. Prior to the pandemic, we used to do something called Queers on Wheels, where we would rent out the roller garden, and
I love it.
Youth could come and be their most fabulous selves, and their supporters and allies could show up too. Unfortunately, the pandemic caused the closure of the roller garden, so we're finding other spaces to create that solidarity. But Youth Pride just happened 2 weekends ago, and that's a great space. We just started a partnership with Family Tree Clinic doing an LGBTQI drop-in for youth ages 13 to 24.
Now, what is that?
Great space for youth to be their whole selves. So it's a space for youth to determine what programming they would like. Right now, they're doing a zine workshop, creating their own zines.
A magazine.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and they just did a cooking class. We're going to bring in some artists and some musicians that youth have determined locally that they would like to learn from. So it's just a space for them to be themselves. And one of the most brilliant things I've seen is a young person who's in Connect and also goes to this drop-in really was able to grapple with identity, experiment and explore with their pronouns, their name, and they have just blossomed into this beautiful young person who is now advocating for themselves, speaking their truth, and living authentically. And it's just a beauty to watch.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah. And Thank you, Ryan, for coming and having this wonderful conversation with us. Ryan's organization is Avenues for Youth. His program is Connect. I'm Jerome Evans. This has been Bottomless Coffee. Find out more about us at bottomlesscoffeeshow.com. See you next time.